What is COPD? Hello and welcome to today's talk as part of the Breathing Space COPD Empowerment course. In this talk I will be aiming to give an overview as to what COPD is and start to introduce some of the ways it can be managed and the monitoring you should receive when living with this condition. By the end of this talk you should have gained a better understanding of what COPD is and how it affects the lungs, the symptoms of COPD, how COPD can be managed through lifestyle changes, a brief overview of the medications used to treat the condition, although this will be covered in more detail in a future talk, and finally the annual health checks you should receive from your healthcare provider when living with this condition. Before discussing how COPD affects our lungs and results in the various symptoms that it produces, it is important to understand what the phrase or term COPD means. COPD stands for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and it is worthwhile as exploring further what this phrase actually means. The first word, chronic, in medicine generally refers to a long-term health condition. A long-term health condition is usually something that cannot be cured, which is unfortunately the case of COPD. And the aim is to control the symptoms and provide people with strategies to manage these. The word obstructive refers to narrowing within the lungs that contributes to the breathlessness associated with COPD. Pulmonary is another word for the lungs. So essentially, COPD is a long-term condition which results in obstruction affecting the way in which air moves in and out of the lungs, resulting in the symptoms associated with the disease. Before understanding how the condition damages the lungs, it is important to have an understanding of their normal structure. This diagram demonstrates the normal structure of the lungs. Air flows from the mouth into a tube which is known as the trachea, which runs down into the chest, where it divides into two smaller tubes called the right and left bronchus. These tubes, or airways, then divide, becoming smaller and smaller, much like the branches of a tree, where they eventually end in tiny air sacs called alveoli. It is in these air sacs that oxygen can move out of the lungs into the body, and waste products such as carbon dioxide can move from the body back into the lungs where they are breathed out. In people with COPD, the lungs are damaged in such a way that changes occur within the airways and the air sacs. The changes within the airways are termed chronic bronchitis. Chronic because it is a long-term problem, and bronchitis due to them becoming inflamed. This inflammation results in the tubes becoming narrower. Furthermore, there is an increased production of sputum within the tubes, which affects the way air moves and results in a chronic cough and sputum production. The changes occurring within the air sacs are referred to as emphysema. In this condition, the walls that separate each of the sacs break down, so you end up with large holes within them, which causes air to get trapped. This makes it harder to breathe, as you cannot empty your lungs fully when breathing out, resulting in less space in the lungs to breathe in new air. As a result of this, people with COPD have a combination of what is termed chronic bronchitis and emphysema. It is these two conditions that result in the symptoms associated with the disease. So what are the symptoms of COPD? The symptoms that people with COPD will often experience include cough, production of sputum, frequent chest infections and breathlessness. What are the causes of COPD? Essentially, COPD occurs as a result of inhaling harmful chemicals over a prolonged period of time. The most common of these is cigarette smoke. However, chemicals arising from air pollution, dust, or through the workplace can also play a part. The fumes produced by wood burners can also result in COPD if exposed to them over time. In a small number of people, a genetic abnormality resulting in deficiency of an enzyme called alpha-1 antitrypsin can also result in the development of COPD. So how is COPD diagnosed? In short, the only way to diagnose COPD is through a test called spirometry. This test involves blowing into a tube for as long as possible, which allows the medical team to measure how much air you are able to expel from your lungs and how quickly you can do so. We're then able to look at these figures to work out whether you have any difficulty with blowing air out of your lungs. If you've been told that you have COPD and have never undertaken a spirometry test, I would recommend that you speak to your healthcare provider, as without having done this test, you cannot be formally diagnosed with COPD. Sometimes X-rays and CT scans can suggest a person has COPD, but these alone are not diagnostic of the condition, and spirometry should always be undertaken to confirm the diagnosis. So how is COPD managed? Management of COPD, as with any long-term condition, has a number of layers involved in the treatment. I like to think of this as a pyramid, whereby you need a solid foundation to form the base, in which you can then add other layers such as medications or specialist treatment provided by the hospital. I'd like to start by discussing the lifestyle changes, as these are the areas which will have the greatest impact in terms of slowing down how quickly the symptoms of your COPD worsen and enable you to continue living an active life. The most important thing anybody with COPD can do is to stop smoking if this is something you are currently doing. We know that over time, the ability of everybody's lungs to move air in and out gradually reduces, regardless of whether or not you smoke. However, in those who are susceptible to the effects of smoking, the rate at which this reduces is significantly faster than if you were to stop smoking. From the moment you stop smoking, this rate of worsening slows down. I cannot emphasise enough how crucial stopping smoking is in order to slow down the damage to your lungs that occurs because of COPD. For anybody who currently does smoke, we know that the most effective way to stop is with a combination of medication and support which can be provided through the West Northamptonshire Smoking Cessation Service. Their contact details are shown on the screen and we will provide this information to you at the end of the group. Another important factor in looking after your lungs and keeping healthy when living with COPD is to ensure that you're undertaking regular physical activity or exercise. A lot of people worry that when they undertake some form of activity and become breathless, that they are causing further damage to their lungs. I want to emphasise that this is not the case and that making yourself breathless for activity does not speed up the progression of COPD or result in further damage to your lungs. What we do know is that people who undertake regular physical activity are able to walk further and are less likely to suffer from severe infections resulting in them having to go into hospital. It can be quite daunting to undertake physical activity and exercise when you're struggling with breathlessness. In order to assist with beginning this journey, there is a course run by the Restart team at Northampton General Hospital, which is called Pulmonary Rehabilitation. This is an exercise-based programme run over a number of weeks that occurs in local community centres. We know that people who undertake this course are able to walk further by the end of it and are less likely to be admitted to hospital due to their COPD. In my opinion, along with stopping smoking, this is the number one intervention that is going to improve your symptoms related to COPD. We know from studies that in order to prevent one person being admitted to hospital, we would have to treat 20 people with an inhaler. For every 4 people that attend the pulmonary rehabilitation course, we will prevent one person being admitted to hospital. The statistics show that pulmonary rehabilitation is therefore a very safe and effective treatment for COPD and can be far more effective than using inhaled medications. It is important that upon completion of this course, you continue to undertake regular physical activity. It is recommended by the World Health Organization that people aim to complete 150 minutes of moderate level physical activity a week. This should be spread out over the course of the week and broken down into smaller chunks, for example 30 minutes 5 times a week or 15 minutes 10 times a week, essentially whatever works best for you. What is meant by moderate level activity? The simplest way to determine this is to see whether you can maintain a conversation while undertaking your preferred activity. If you are able to continue talking to a friend, however would not be able to sing a song, then you are likely undertaking activity at a moderate level. If you are not able to complete a sentence, then you are probably overexerting and should reduce the intensity back a bit. This concept is one of the key things taught on a pulmonary rehabilitation course, along with simple exercises you can undertake at home. Another key aspect of looking after your lung health when living with COPD is vaccinations. It is recommended that everybody with COPD has an annual flu vaccine and also is fully vaccinated against COVID and has boosters against this when offered. It is also recommended that everybody living with COPD should have a pneumococcal vaccine, which is a one-off vaccine that can reduce the risks of pneumonia. We know that viruses in particular can lead to COPD exacerbations, which is when your condition worsens suddenly. Each exacerbation causes a small but permanent reduction in your lungs, so if you are having repeated infections, your symptoms are likely to worsen more quickly. Vaccinations can help to reduce the number of exacerbations and therefore help to keep your lungs working as well as possible. I would now like to talk about some of the common medications that are used in the community to help manage COPD. There will be a talk that goes into this in more detail later in the programme, but I do want to just touch now on inhalers, as these are the main way in which medication is used to treat COPD. There are currently more than 20 different inhaler devices in use, all of which contain a different type of medication and in some cases may contain 2 or 3 different medicines. It is important that you know what type of inhaler you have, as this will determine how it is used. This will be discussed in more detail in a later talk. Finally, I would like to finish by discussing the annual reviews that you should be receiving from your healthcare provider in relation to your COPD. Ideally, you should be seen at least once a year, and in some cases twice a year if your condition is particularly severe. This review should cover a number of areas, including the current problems you are experiencing and how much these are affecting you. You should also discuss how many exacerbations of your condition you have had in the last year, and your medications and inhalers should be reviewed. This is particularly important to ensure that you are using the inhaler correctly, as using an inhaler incorrectly is a common reason as to why the medication does not work. We will be addressing this in a future talk. The review should also inquire as to whether you are currently smoking, and if so, offer support to help you stop. You should also have your weight checked, as we know that in people who are underweight or overweight, this can affect the severity of your symptoms that you are experiencing. If you have not already had them, you should be given the opportunity to receive an influenza vaccine, as well as a pneumococcal vaccine and COVID booster. Finally, you should have your oxygen levels measured and be assessed to ensure that there are no other conditions that are impacting upon the symptoms of your COPD. I hope you found this introduction to COPD useful, and we will now take any further questions if you have any.